You know that an episode doesn't really work when the person who actually wrote it tends to agree. Welcome to the Lost Explained episode guide, in which we will be exploring and explaining Lost, episode by episode, mystery by mystery. These guides are spoiler heavy, so only watch if you have actually finished the show and already know the secrets of the island. Homecoming is the 15th episode of season 1, and it's another Charlie-centric episode, his second this season. Claire returns to the camp with no memory of what happened to her, or of her fellow castaways, and Ethan re-emerges from the jungle to demand that they give Claire back to him, or else he will start picking off the survivors one by one. Charlie finds himself desperate to be of use in the fight, but he can't quite find his footing, and neither can the episode. Let's get into it. Now, what should be one of the most exciting episodes of the season is a bit of a damp squib, and part of that is because the focus of the drama is on Charlie, who is someone who has the least at stake when it comes to the events that are transpiring. Sure, he cares about Claire and what happens to her, but ultimately he feels secondary to everything happening. I suppose that was the point. Charlie wants to help, but he is constantly shut out, which leads him to taking his own extreme measures later on. The problem is that we as an audience are also stuck with him when we really want to be elsewhere. Not only are Charlie's flashbacks in this episode incredibly drab and totally thematically tenuous to the main island storyline, but by structuring such a crucial series of events around this particular character and playing it out mostly from his point of view, it feels like the action is playing out removed at a distance. I think the story would have been far more involving had Claire been the audience surrogate. I know she already had a centric episode fairly recently, but this episode is really all about her. Ethan is trying to get to her, our castaways are trying to protect her, she is clearly the linchpin of the conflict, yet Charlie is the one getting the spotlight. Homecoming demonstrates the issues that the writers often had in needing to fulfill season orders of 22 or more episodes. It was always in the mid-half of one of these long seasons when they could be caught spinning their wheels like this, essentially trying to buy time until they hit that final sprint towards the finale with the last 4 or 5 episodes of a season. We will see this problem manifest again in year 2, with how long the Henry Gale arc is dragged out, and then again in year 3, which has more filler than a Botox clinic. For every gem of an episode like Trisha Tanaka is dead, we have a stranger in a strange land, and that is also true in season 1 as well. Co-creator and showrunner Damon Lindelof has gone on record that Homecoming is his least favourite episode of the show ever. Here's what he had to say. I think my least favourite episode is this episode that we did in the first season called Homecoming. It's when Claire comes back from having been in the jungle for a couple of days after she was abducted by the others, and Ethan comes after her. The backstory is Charlie is trying to go straight and he's selling copiers. At the end of the episode, he shoots Ethan. I wrote that episode, and it's my least favourite episode of the show ever. Quick editorial note from me, it was more than a couple of days, Damon. She was gone for a whole week. Okay, it's probably no coincidence that Lindelof is the sole writer of record in the credits, therefore he isn't throwing any of his fellow writers under the bus by naming it as his least favourite, but I wholeheartedly agree with him. This is a totally fair pick. First of all, the flashbacks might just be the worst from the entire series. I know that everyone takes aim at Stranger in a Strange Land, and as silly as those flashbacks are, they aren't nearly as boring nor as forgettable as the ones from Homecoming. I defy anyone to vividly recall the scenes of Charlie trying to swindle a valuable cigarette case from a rich family in order to feed his habit. This subplot barely hangs together, and I find it really hard to care about Charlie and his drug dilemmas in this particular flashback story. Especially when the show will go on to capture the desperation of addiction later in this very same season with just one single scene, when we see a desperate Charlie fight an even more desperate one-night stand over a bag of heroin in a hotel room. There is more power in that one scene than all of the flashback scenes in this episode. The only truly memorable scene from this backstory is Charlie trying, and failing, to sell copy machines, which culminates in him throwing up on one. And that just about sums it up, doesn't it? This is truly the dregs of flashback narrative in Lost, and it's probably the only part of a rewatch when I seriously consider skipping them altogether. Elsewhere, the on-island story fares a little bit better, but not by much. The episode wastes the potential of the premise that was set up from Claire's return and Ethan's ultimatum to the group, which provides a genuine threat to everyone's safety. Instead, much like we saw in Whatever the Case May Be, the episode finds a way to quickly shut down dramatic possibilities. Firstly, Claire having amnesia is plain old lame.
Who are you? Who are you people?
I hated this back when I first saw it, and I hate it upon every single rewatch. Memory loss is the laziest plot device imaginable. When writers don't know what to do or find themselves needing to stretch for time, amnesia is the go-to cliche. By its very nature, amnesia brings a character and their storyline to a dead stop, and effectively allows their story to reset, until the writers need the character to remember again later at a more convenient time to the plot. Then we have Ethan threatening the group with a death every day until Claire is returned to him, and we see that he really means business this time. All of the scenes involving Ethan are probably the best parts of this episode. William Mapother once again bringing the requisite menace to the part, and seeing him suddenly emerge from the trees to throttle Charlie is still a heart-stopping moment.
Charlie, I want her back.
What?
I want you to bring her back.
And so it follows that the elements that do work in this episode mostly all revolve around our castaways' attempts to combat Ethan, whether it's their plan to fortify their borders and form a ring of protection around Claire, or Jack finally revealing to Locke that they are sitting on a small arsenal of weapons.
Why, Doctor, you've been holding out on us.
All drafting in Sawyer as additional manpower, who in turn drafts in Kate, despite Jack's wishes, which is a particularly delicious moment. Watching the group work together as one is always very satisfying to see. It helps to highlight that even when they have their own internal fractures and hang-ups, they can still come together for the common good and act as a collective. Although we see that poor old Steve, sorry, I meant Scott, is the one to draw the short straw and get sacrificed. This isn't like the other deaths that have happened as a result of the plane crash or accidents. This is murder, and a brutal one at that. It's a demonstration of not just Ethan's stealth and strength, but also of his resolve. And he wants to inflict fear and panic on everyone, so much so that they might turn on Claire and cast her out. This is the first time in the show where our castaways are being persecuted as a group. And it is Claire's abduction and this particular death that I believe fuels much of the Oceanic group's hatred of the others in the future. But how much of this was actually Ethan working alone? Juliet later suggests that Ethan initially acted on his own when taking Claire, but was he also acting alone when trying to get her back? More on this under the Jungle of Mystery section. Charlie and Claire try to reconnect throughout the episode to varying degrees of success. The first instance sees Charlie inform the discombobulated Claire that
Ethan's the bad guy.
Which felt very much like a meta nod to the audience who, up to this point, might have been wondering who the real antagonist of the series was supposed to be, especially as attitudes towards Sawyer and Jin were beginning to soften. Of course, Charlie's declaration that Ethan is the big bad is almost immediately undermined by the big bad being disposed of rather unceremoniously by the plot. Claire later confronts Charlie about keeping her in the dark regarding Ethan's threat, which very much feels like a contrivance. Again, this would dramatically play better if Claire had been the focus of the episode, rather than Charlie, since it is her life being wagered and hanging in the balance. Then finally, Claire offers Charlie an olive branch as she half recalls a cute moment shared between them over some imaginary peanut butter, which suggests the possibility that her memory is slowly coming back. So there are some effective scenes and sequences strewn throughout Homecoming that either provide some reasonable atmosphere and suspense or absorbing character interactions, but so much of that is undone by the larger creative decisions taken. And none more so than the resolution to the Ethan problem. The way that Ethan's death is engineered is beyond frustrating. He is caught in this elaborate mousetrap by the oceanic survivors that gives us a rematch between Ethan and Jack in the same rainy conditions in which they last tangled. Jack emerges victorious despite it not really being a fair fight, since even if Jack had lost, Ethan would then have to go through Locke, Saeed and Sawyer, and I wouldn't fancy his chances coming out on top of that. Anyway, after all of this effort, all of the mud and the blood, our group finally has Ethan as their prisoner. This climax is a remarkable turnaround that single-handedly elevates and redeems the lackluster nature of what came before, and I just can't wait to see what happens next. Oh. Forget everything I just said. So Charlie pops up to shoot Ethan dead, and therefore shuts the door on the storyline potential of that character forever. Sure, it works in terms of showing us how unstable Charlie can be, and how traumatised he was from what Ethan did to him and Claire, but it's also just an incredibly contrived moment, which feels cynically engineered to help the writers get out of a corner they had written themselves into. Now, I'm fairly certain that almost all of us who watched this for the first time probably had the same initial thought after Ethan was captured. Finally, we can get some answers out of this guy. Unfortunately, the writers were thinking, damn it, finally we have to give them some answers out of this guy. Basically, the reason for killing Ethan off was entirely about retreating from plot lines they had opened up the door to with Raised by Another. They realised that they couldn't have their only established other get captured and start spilling secrets. They were in the thick of season 1, and this show had to run and run and run for the foreseeable future, and at this point the writers were still building up the mythology on the island, so there was no real way Ethan could become a prisoner. They weren't quite ready for a Henry Gale story arc just yet. Alternatively, allowing Ethan to escape and disappear into the jungle again would have felt generally unsatisfying, but it would have also left him as a loose thread to be tied off in another episode. And the main problem with kicking the Ethan can further down the road would have been fans constantly asking, when is Ethan coming back? Why hasn't Ethan come back? Is Ethan going to come back? Is he going to kidnap Claire again? Why isn't he kidnapping Claire again? Are we going to find out why he kidnapped Claire in the first place? And so on and so on. So really their best option was to contrive a way to kill him off and move on as quickly as possible. They could always introduce more others in the back half of the season if needed, which they do. So I get the creative logic behind making this particular decision. It just sucks for the story and renders much of the Claire and Ethan arc of the season kind of a non-event. At the very least, I wish they had come up with a better way to kill him that felt more unavoidable, and less like Charlie acting as a proxy executioner on behalf of the writer's room. I don't know if I ever really believed that Charlie would do this, because the episode doesn't gas him up enough to pull the trigger. I never thought I'd say this, but we really needed the Charlie of Season 2's Fire plus Water to make this work. Either way, this didn't help endear me or others to Charlie as a character, and marked the beginning of a long series of questionable creative choices for that character. I view Ethan being murdered as the first moment in the show where I genuinely felt like I could see the writers trying real hard to stop their story from progressing too fast. To me, this is one step forward, two steps back storytelling, and this would ultimately begin to frustrate many viewers by the time we got to season 3. Homecoming is a very early sign of that happening. I do tend to agree with Damon Lindelof here that Homecoming is one of the worst episodes of the season, and one of the weaker episodes of the series, mainly because of how much of its potential was squandered. Why does Claire have amnesia? Season 2 episode Maternity Leave shows how Claire was being drugged by Ethan during her time in the staff station in order to keep her both amenable and compliant. At one point, Claire claims that the water Ethan gives her tastes sour.
What?
That's really sour.
Is it? I hadn't noticed.
Blech.
Which implies that the water has been laced with some kind of narcotic. Once the effects of this have worn off, and after a fairly sizable concussion from meeting the business end of Russo's rifle, but over time, and with some help, she manages to access and recall these lost memories. Where has Claire been, and how did she escape? Maternity leave will also show us what happened to Claire during that missing week, in which Ethan held her captive at the staff station. She was being kept under close observation so that Ethan could continue administering Juliet's serum via a series of daily injections. The others had hoped that they would be able to bring this baby to term by any means necessary, even if that meant inducing labour and surgically removing the baby. Either way, they fully expected the procedure to cost the mother her life. It is only because Danielle Rousseau's daughter Alex became aware of this situation, infiltrated the staff, and got Claire out of there, that this terrible fate was avoided. It also seems that Alex might have had some help, because Claire is knocked out, then carried clear of the staff by quite some distance. We can fairly assume that Alex's partner in crime was probably none other than Carl, and together they got Claire to safety. And as fate would have it, Claire would then be discovered by Alex's mother Danielle, who adds a concussion to this poor pregnant woman's list of physical and psychological traumas. But she does so for a good reason, and leaves Claire close to the cave so that the mother-to-be will find the way back to her people. Why does Ethan have a bloody scratch on his face? I think the scratch alludes to the possibility that the writers might have originally intended for Claire's escape to have been more physical and intense, and that she fought with Ethan in order to get away from him. Hence his face being scratched. As with quite a few setups in year 1, the writers figured that they would cross that mystery bridge when they came to answering it in season 2. However, by the time they got there, they'd decided that Claire would escape thanks to the help of the Russos. And honestly, that's a much better reveal than Claire simply fighting Ethan off, then running away and somehow accidentally finding her way back to the camp. In my own headcanon, I like to think that this might have actually been Alex, who confronted Ethan after helping Claire escape, argued with him, and clawed at his face in the heat of the moment. It's also possible that Juliet could have scratched Ethan too. I really find it hard to accept that Juliet would have gone along with operating on Claire if it meant causing Claire's death. She is shown to have great compassion for her patients, regardless of the circumstances. Just look at how she is as an undercover other with Sun. So perhaps Ben and Ethan might have intentionally frozen Juliet out of this process so she wouldn't challenge or try to prevent the operation, and when she finds out, she digs those nails in. Either of these scenarios work for me, but let me know in the comments if you have any alternative ideas and theories for why those scratches are there. How did Ethan come from the ocean?
Thought those guys had the full-on perimeter setup.
Locke said it didn't matter. Came in from the water.
What I find fascinating about Scott's death is how it initially appears to be this demonstration of supernatural uncanniness, when in fact it was really just hinting at the sort of technological advancements that the others possessed. But we, the audience, were much like our losties. We didn't factor in the possibility that Ethan might be part of a more advanced society, so therefore our first suspicions tended to lean more towards a supernatural means. Just goes to show you how easy it is to attribute magic to something that can be explained more logically. So, Scott's death kicks up several hints about what is to come. Firstly, it alludes to the possibility that Ethan came from somewhere offshore, and that a place like Hydra Island was already in the back pocket of the writer's room. It also follows that Ethan must have a boat. In the season 1 finale, we see that confirmed. Tom Friendly shows up on a short-range boat to kidnap Walt, which is used for the purposes of ferrying people to and from Hydra Island, although the engine might be a little bit noisy enough to hear coming. So I tend to think that Ethan probably used one of the outriggers, which would have provided a perfectly silent approach to the beach during the night. Then he likely used one of the stun darts on Scott to knock him out first, so that the man could be killed without raising the alarm. And there we are, with just a little bit of logic applied of things that we know the others possess. It turns out there was nothing supernatural about this death at all. Why didn't the others just take Claire back? I've seen some people ask this question before, and I always felt that this was indirectly addressed and answered in The Other 48 Days. We first see that the others aren't afraid to take people by force under the cover of night. They invade the camp of the 23-strong group of survivors from the tail section and snatch several people, then return later to snatch 9 more. We can see that they are very adept at these type of clandestine operations. However, there's a few things worth noting here. The first is that the tail section crashed in a location that was very close to the barracks. Ben tells Goodwin that he could make the shoreline within the hour. So the fact that the tailies are in such close proximity to where the others actually live makes them a more immediate and easier target than our fuselage survivors on the other side of the island. The others are forced to put their plans on pause after they lose 2 of their people during the operation at the hands of Mr. Echo. The second consideration to factor in here is that there are almost 50 survivors initially on Team Jack compared to Team Ana Lucia. Team Jack also arm themselves pretty quickly thanks to the Marshal's gun, and then later the guns in the briefcase, so it is a much greater risk to take on such a large number of people. Plus, Ben can't risk Dr. Jack getting injured or killed in a struggle, nor does he want to see his people bring back the fabled John Locke. So I think these are the various reasons why the others never attack the beach camp in force until Ben is backed into a corner in Season 3, when his position as leader becomes untenable. I would like to pour one out in honour of Scott. We barely knew you, Scott. In fact, we barely even knew to call you by the right name. The running gag of Scott or Steve comes to a head in this episode. We first got a joke about these 2 interchangeable survivors in The Moth with this line.
We gotta go. Hey, Scott?
I'm Steve.
I'm Scott. We got an emergency. Come on, grab a couple of guys and
followed by Hurley referencing them in Raised by Another.
I'm out here looking for some psycho with Scott and Steve, right? And I'm realizing, who the hell are Scott and Steve?
Even co-showrunner Carlton Cuse admitted that he had no idea who was who, and that even the writers' room had lost track. They had to use a note card to remind themselves that Scott is dead and Steve is alive. So this running gag of interchangeable names was ultimately born out of this natural confusion behind the scenes. And so the short TV life of Scott and or Steve comes to a brutal close. It turns out that he was one of Boone's aforementioned red shirts. In fact, all of the background survivors will turn out to be red shirts by the time Season 5 does away with them all in a flaming arrow attack. Scott actually has the distinction of being the first of the survivors to be buried in an area that will go on to become the Oceanic Cemetery, that will see everyone from Boone and Shannon to Locke, and most likely Jack, take up residence there. It's the first grave of many. In the flashbacks, the target of Charlie's scam is Lucy Heatherton, who admonishes him for his behaviour and the betrayal of trust by proclaiming,
"You'll never take care of anyone."
This, of course, is what Charlie's character arc is ultimately building towards, because one day he will care for 2 people so deeply that he will be ready and willing to give his life for theirs. Another moment that foreshadows tragedy is when Jack talks about his reluctance to hand out the guns.
There are 4 9mm in Marshall's case.
No. I hand them out. Someone hears something out in the jungle, gets scared. Chances of us shooting each other are much higher than of us shooting him.
Well, this proves to be prophecy, because this is exactly what happens in Season 2 when Ana Lucia uses one of those very same guns to shoot Shannon in the jungle upon mistaking her for another. There is this really cool image of John Locke and Ethan engaged in a fight that circulated for many years but is nowhere to be seen in the show. This is actually from a deleted scene where Ethan breaks through the security perimeter and fights Locke first, and Locke manages to stab Ethan in the thigh before being knocked out. I imagine that this scene was just cut for length, but Ethan does retain a noticeable limp from that encounter. As far as this channel is aware, this deleted scene has never surfaced or been released to the public, but I'm sure I speak for many fans when I say how cool it would be to see it someday. Although in a way it's actually better for the continuity that this sequence doesn't exist in the canon of the actual show, since we later learn that Ethan was well aware of Locke some years in advance, and that it would be very unlikely for him to want to hurt or kill the man. The numbers pop up in a couple of instances. Locke says they should set up 4 booby traps around the camp in order to create a perimeter. The copy machine that Charlie tries to sell on behalf of the Heatherton family business is model C815. Then Charlie promptly vomits all over it. One of the biggest wink-wink jokes of the series can be found in this episode as it relates to Charlie's backstory. In passing, Lucy mentions that her father is buying some paper company in Slough.
So where is the old man?
I don't know. I think he's buying some paper company up in Slough.
This is a very intentional reference to the British sitcom The Office, created by Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant. And it always makes me laugh at the idea that Lost and The Office exist in the same universe. In the next episode guide, we are getting back on track with Outlaws, a moody Sawyer-centric episode that will allow us to discuss the Whispers in more detail, as well as animal manifestations on the show. Please like, share and subscribe to keep this channel alive. Check out my Patreon where you can catch all of these videos earlier and enjoy some exclusive content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you back on the island.